comparative literature at UC Berkeley, where he co-founded the Peace and Conflict Studies program. You can find the recordings of his classes in webcast. He is also the founder of Meta Center of Nonviolence and is a recipient of the prestigious MacArthur Foundation Research Fellowship Award, which is considered as the Genius Grant. One of his famous books, winner of the 2002 American Book Award, is The Search for a Nonviolent Future. His credentials speak to his expertise on the subject, but which is unspeakable or has not been conveyed is his authority on the subject. I request Professor Michael Nagler to deliver his talk, Nonviolence, the Bridge between Spiritual Practice and Social Change. A very important subject. When I heard about the title, I found that yes, probably this is a wonderful topic on which we can progress in our spiritual life. At the same time, it can help the social change. So I would request Professor Nagler to continue his lecture.
Thank you so much. Rama, Rama, Rama. Swamiji, thank you so very much for that introduction. I should say that I didn't actually receive a MacArthur Genius Award. I suggested that they give me one several times, but I got a much smaller grant. But I did get a Jamnalal Bajaj Award for spreading Gandhian values outside of India. That was about as close, I think, to the Genius Award, and about as close as I'll ever get to being a genius. Well, I am very, very happy to be here speaking with you. I have such fragrant memories of this place. Many, many years ago, when I had just started in the spiritual life, I'd been meditating for about 6 or 7 years, and my copy of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna was completely worn out. It was just like threadbare. It's like the clothes that I was wearing out to the garden. The cover had fallen off. I had just been through it so many times, and I wanted very much to buy a new copy, and they were selling books here at that time. Don't know if you still are. So I come over one day from campus and just knocked on the door, and Swami Swahananda was in charge at that time. If you remember him, he was a wonderful man. And he was very chagrined to have to tell me that they didn't have a copy of the gospel. And I looked very disappointed. And he said, "Come with me." And he took me into his little room, just a simple little room with a simple little cot. And he gave me his own personal copy from off his reading table, which I have treasured. Of course, I'm now on my third copy, but I treasured that one, and the fragrance of that experience has always stayed with me. And in my experience, the kindness of the monks of the Ramakrishna order is very much universal among them. That is, or just something like that just stays in your heart, simple as it may seem. So I'd like to start with my topic, that nonviolence as the bridge between spiritual practice and social change, by sharing with you that when I was still teaching in the Peace and Conflict Studies program here at the university, often my students would get very engaged and involved in problems that were going on in the world. And you know, Berkeley, there's always some kind of action going on in response to those problems. So whatever it would be, you know, racism or what have you, they would go out to a rally on campus, Brow Plaza, and they would come staggering back about 20 minutes later. And I would always say, "What's the matter?" But I knew perfectly well what was the matter. They said, "We can't stand it. All the hatred, all the bitterness, all the disrespect for human beings." And that to me was the perfect example of the mismatch between spirituality and social change. Today, if you go out into any kind of protest, you very often find that the spirit, the mental state of people in that protest is such that they're going to make things less peaceful rather than more. So a lot of my life has been about how do we get into spiritual, let me start that again. How do we get into social work without disturbing the spiritual effort that we've put in? You know, I'll tell you another story. We had, in the early days of our ashram, we had a friend who was very agitated about racism going on in the city, and there was some kind of rally or demonstration taking place at San Francisco State, and he said he was going to go down there. And our teacher, Sri Eknath Ishran, said, "I don't advise you to go. I don't think that's a good idea." But he said, "Well, don't worry, Ishran, I'm just going to be watching. I'm just going to observe. I'm not going to get involved." So a couple of hours later, we get a phone call. "Hi, it's me. Could somebody come down and bail me out?" What happened, John? "I'm not sure. When I came to, I was sitting on the policeman." So we don't want politics to be without spirituality, but how are we going to mix politics into our spirituality without losing the benefits, the peace that we gained in meditation? Back in 2005, Rabbi Michael Lerner and I put on the first spiritual activism conference here again on campus, and I remember Van Jones saying, "When spiritual people get active and activists get spirituality, watch out. That's really going to be, you know, the winning combination." But I have discovered with my colleagues at the Metta Center that the only way that you can express yourself in the world as a spiritual aspirant without damaging your own spiritual practice is to do that through nonviolence. So in the Gandhian worldview, that what happened during the Vietnam era, when there was such anger against the anger of the war, was just an extreme example. In the Gandhian worldview, which to a large extent I've tried to assimilate, it's a mental state that determines the result of your action. If you go into an action in an angry mood, you will add to the violence. If you go into an action with a stable, calm, loving mind, being aware of the humanity of the people with whom you have to deal, that is absolutely critical. No matter what happens, you will end up having a beneficial effect on the situation. And so we actually have developed a formula at the Metta Center called work versus work. I know that doesn't sound like it's going to win any awards in Hollywood, but it's work, quote unquote, versus work without quotes. Work, quote unquote, meaning it did what you wanted it to do. work without quotes, meaning it did beneficial work on the system. And sometimes, very often actually, in nonviolence, we find that those are not the same thing. There's a study recently that was done by a colleague of mine at Boulder, Erica Chenoweth, and her partner Maria Stefan, where they studied 200 uprisings, freedom struggles, having taken place between 1900 and 2006, and found that the ones that were done nonviolently, and mind you, this is what Gandhi would have called the nonviolence of the weak. This was just people going out there for the most part saying, we won't throw a rock because we know the repercussions will be worse. Not, I'm going to cling to nonviolence as the pole star of my life because all human beings have the same dignity, or some such thing. So it's a very low entry-level kind of nonviolence that they were studying, and yet they found that those nonviolent uprisings were successful 56% of the time, whereas the violent ones were successful 23% of the time. So they were twice as successful if they were nonviolent, even in this minimalist way. Not only that, but they took about 3 years to be accomplished, while violent insurrections took, on the average, 9 years. And now we come to the point that I really wanted to make. Thank you for your patience. She also studied to what degree does this action lead to a more democratic society. And she found that the nonviolent ones were 10 times more likely to lead to democracy than the violent ones, which in itself, I guess, is not too surprising when you think that democracy is really based on the dignity of the human being, the dignity of the individual. But the really surprising thing is that the nonviolent ones were 4 times as likely to lead to a democratic system, or a more democratic system, even if they failed. As you would attack the system, you want to get rid of the dictator or what have you, and at the end of the day, he's still there. But because you have injected nonviolence into the situation, it will translate within 5 years into a more democratic regime. So meditation enables us to preserve our nonviolence in the face of threats. That's the other side of this. And Thich Nhat Hanh said, you may say that you believe in nonviolence, but when you get out there and the police are coming at you and the dogs or some kind of thugs are threatening you, your nonviolence is going to go out the window unless you have it based on a stable, steady meditation practice. So it really goes both ways. You lose your meditation if it's too fragile when you go into a violent situation, and you cannot maintain it unless your spirituality has increased to a certain level. But let's step back a little, and there's a verse from chapter 7 of the Bhagavad Gita, which I'm going to interpret in my own special way. I have absolutely no authority to do this, but I suspect it may be helpful and interesting, so I'm going to try. The verse is verse 29, Jara marana mokshaye mam ashritya yatantiye te brahmatad viduhu kirtsnam adhyatman karma chakilam. And I take that to mean that really there are 3 things everyone needs to know. Who are you? Who is God? And what is the nature of action? So let us step back a little bit. There are, as we know, 4 yogas, 4 basic approaches to spiritual fulfillment. And as it happens, each of those 4 yogas has had an avatar level figure representing it in the modern age. For Bhakti Yoga, of course, we have the great master, under whose blessing and auspices we're gathered here together tonight. For Jnana Yoga, I would take Sri Ramana Maharshi in Tiruvannamalai. And for Raja Yoga, The person who identifies himself there is Sri Aurobindo. But now, I bet you know what I'm leading up to. One of the first people ever to achieve complete spiritual fulfillment, which I think he did, as a karma yogi, was Mahatma Gandhi. Now, of course, he wasn't interested in advertising that fact. In a book that I'm going to be telling you about in a little while, there's an episode where he was giving a talk, and someone came up to him and said, "I want you to declare yourself as an avatar." And he said to this person, "Sit down and be quiet." But on the other hand, when he was visiting a particular ashram somewhere in India and spent a few hours there and went away, the disciples gathered around the preceptor, the guru of this ashram, and the guru, for his impressions, and the guru said, "Today we have been visited by a real yogi." And they asked him, "Well, how could you tell?" He said, "You know, you people, and most of the people with him, they act like they've had 4 pairs of eyes. They're just all over the place. Gandhiji, whatever he did, he gave his total one-pointed attention." And I'm going to show you a photograph in a little while that illustrates that. So let's see, can I change slides by, how do I do that? There we go. Very good, thank you. Well, this is just a down arrow. Okay, good. Okay. So this is just to share with you our website and our motto, promoting nonviolence worldwide, and one of our favorite statements by Gandhiji, nonviolence is the greatest power at the disposal of humankind. I think that's probably in itself about the most profound lesson that we have to learn in the modern world. Now here's the book that I was telling you about. The slide is a little bit shortened. It's called Mahatma, Gandhi's Life in Color. There are 240 photographs of Gandhiji in this book, starting from the earliest period till the very end of his mortal life, and they were colorized. And when I first heard about this, I thought, that's a sacrilege. You can't do that. But after living with that book for a while, I found that it's a wonderful way to immerse ourselves in Gandhi's life and surroundings. So this is that expression that I was mentioning to you. He was reading something and somebody called him and he looked up, and you know, unless you are meditating yourself, it might be hard for you to understand the significance of this. But the way that he was able to give absolutely everything, his absolutely one-pointed attention, is the sign of great spiritual advancement. And yet there he is, the most effective karma yogi, I think, certainly in the modern world, or possibly that the world has ever known. He worked 15, 16 hours a day for close to 50 years. When he was in London, he had 2 secretaries who basically had to be almost hospitalized from exhaustion. He would go and talk to the viceroy about economics without any notes, and talk to the viceroy until the viceroy couldn't follow anymore. Said, "Gandhiji, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to send in my secretary." So Gandhi would keep on talking until the secretary was exhausted. So that titanic energy, that one-pointed focus, and above all, as you're aware, when the Gita talks about any one of these yogas, jnana, bhakti, or karma, it never talks about it in isolation. You can't go more than 2 verses before you find out that jnana is actually karma, is actually bhakti. I mean, for example, in this same chapter, chapter 7, the definition of a jnani, someone who has achieved the end result of spiritual practice by sheer spiritual insight, the ability to instinctively discriminate between the real and the unreal, is defined as someone who goes around saying, Vasudeva Sarvam iti. Krishna is everything. Krishna is everything. That's the Gita's definition of a jnani. So these three paths are intimately woven together in a very non-Western way. And Gandhi also exemplified all three of them, even though karma yoga was the path that he primarily walked. So let's see. Now the question of right action, which I was telling you I think is the definition reached in chapter 7, verse 29, the question of what is dharma, how shall we be, how shall we act as human beings, is answered repeatedly in the Mahabharata with this famous phrase that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, ahimsa paramo dharma, that the highest dharma, the greatest obligation, the most exquisite fulfillment for everyone, for every human being, is nonviolence. However, dharma, that is the absolute dharma in what we might call the avyakta or the unmanifested world. In the manifested world, dharma gets subdivided. And so, for example, if you look at time, there is a yuga dharma, which means the dharma of each age. And it will be slightly different in focus from one age to the next. The dharma of our age is truth, according to many authorities. You know, there's a guy who every couple of years he goes around the U.S. With a camera and he asks people, what does America need? Sometimes it's very funny. He asked somebody who was hard of hearing one time, what does America need? And she said, what do Americans eat? He said, no, what does America need? And on one occasion he asked a young woman, what does America need? She looked up at the camera and said, truth. Truth, truth. And I think that for our age, in our yuga, and especially with, I'm going to try not to stray into politics, but I just did. With what's going on right now, I think we can agree that that is the dharma of our age. Anyway, each age has a dharma, and each moment has a dharma. Nimisha means an eye blink. So at every second, we have a very meaningful, creative choice between dharma and adharma. So that's dharma entering the regime of vyakta, the manifested world, looked at through the lens of time. But dharma manifested through social space, that is, among human beings, there are the famous theory of the four dharmas, roughly the four castes, but particularly, as you can tell because it's a different color and a larger font, what I want to emphasize here is the concept of svadharma, that every one of us has a dharma. So, let's see. Let's see where we go from here. Yeah. Here are the characteristics of one's svadharma. How do you choose it? Your svadharma must embody the dharma, that is the dharma of ahimsa. You cannot say my svadharma is a thief. That just happens to be the family I'm born into. That's I'm real good at it. I get a lot of fulfillment out of robbing people. Sorry, you may be conditioned to feel that way, but in reality, if you are not embodying in your own special person the power of nonviolence, you're violating dharma. Another aspect of it that's elaborated in the 18th chapter of the Gita, this is mostly from chapter 7 and 18, but they're really scattered throughout the Gita, is that you shouldn't expect that in the world that we live in, the world of manifestation, that your actions will be perfect. And you should never, this is quoting the 18th chapter, should never desist from your appointed dharma just because it's not perfect. In fact, the Gita says twice, and it doesn't usually repeat itself in this way, it's better to carry out your own dharma, shrayam swadharmo vigunaha, do your own dharma even if it's terrible, even if you're bad at it and it's flawed, do your own dharma rather than try to do the dharma of another. The dharma of another person is terrifying, says the Gita, because you will waste your spiritual life trying to be somebody else, trying to do somebody else's dharma. So dharma may not be abandoned even if it is imperfect. And dharma, our swadharma, is something that we were born with. It's innate to our being, which is niyatam sahaja is another expression for it. Now, in the Chandogya Upanishad, which happens to be a passage that I'm meditating on right now, there's a very gripping verse, which says, I'm going to just do this in Sri Ishwaran's translation, here, meaning in the world that we live in. Well, let me go back just a little bit. The self desires nothing that is not real. The self speaks nothing that is not true. Here people do what they are told. So they become dependent on their country or their piece of land or the desires of another. So their desires are not fulfilled, and their works come to nothing in this world and the next. Now, I think what the Upanishad is giving us there is a definition of paradharma, somebody else's dharma. Somebody tells you should do something, and that's also completely undemocratic, and you completely waste your life spiritually. On the other hand, there's a story about somebody who is worried that when he takes the spiritual life, he'll abandon all of the pleasures of secular existence for nothing. He says to his teacher, what if I give up all of this stuff that advertising tells me that I want, and I don't achieve the goal? I will have wasted my whole life. The teacher calmly says to him, you have wasted so many lives. One more is not going to make a big difference. But now I would like to turn to what a perfect swadharma looks like in our age, embodied as a human being. If there ever was a spiritual text that took life as a human being, it's the way that the Bhagavad Gita took life in the life of Mahatma Gandhi. So let's just sum up the formula before we go ahead, that this, in terms of human action, inaction is impossible. You cannot not act. That's because even our thoughts have an impact on the environment. They have an impact on us, they have an impact on the surrounding environment. Science is actually starting to catch up with this. There is a famous experiment that was carried out by a Mexican neuroscientist and a physics professor by the name of Amit Goswami, where they took two people, had them meditating together, and then they separated them, put them in different rooms, and one of these people was shown a flashing light, something he must have borrowed from the hippie era, the strobe effect, blink, blink. And of course the brain responds to that light flashing signal. And they have ways of detecting this now with magnetic resonance imagery. Now, so that so far is not at all surprising, but what's surprising is the other person had his brain or her brain was also reacting in exactly the same way, even though he or she was not looking at a flashing light. So scientists have begun to explore in various ways what they call subtle energy or subtle interactions among people, which is their way of getting to this truth that that our thoughts affect our environment. Now we may say, okay, look, this morning I prayed for world peace, and look, it's 11 o'clock already, and world peace hasn't happened. What's the matter? Well, the problem is, well, there's two problems really. While you're praying for world peace, there's millions of people out there praying for the opposite. But the real problem is your thoughts are so scattered, shallow, and superficial. So if that's where the concentration that Gandhi so exemplifies comes in. So the point here is that we cannot refrain from action. It doesn't seem to be a big problem for Americans, refraining from action, but I think for Indians it was worrisome, because when you act, you accumulate karma, and that karma is going to weigh you down. So they really, in some cases, tried to live a life without acting at all. A life of complete renunciation. If that was ever possible, and I'm not denying that for some people at some times it might be possible, it is not possible for us in this age and that we're living through. So we have only the option of taking responsibility for our acts. And then we have to think of three things. Choose the right goal, the ahimsa, do no harm. That is to say, the goal must be nonviolent, and you carry it out with nonviolent means, which a lot of people who go into political action today do not understand. And finally, here comes the subtle part. And the Gita says that understanding action is very deep. But this is one of the reasons it's so hard to grasp. You are not to be attached to the results of your work, which the Gita calls a phalam, or the fruit. Now, superficially, you might think that means, oh, well, I don't care what happens. No, you care, but you don't try to own it personally. You don't try to benefit individually from the fruits of your actions. If you do that, the next thing you know, you're going to choose your actions for your own personal benefit. And then you will be very far off the track. I can give you an example of how subtle this can be. When I was a graduate student at Berkeley and during the free speech movement, those were the days, huh? We were so idealistic and so impassioned, and nothing had ever happened like that before. We'd call a rally and 20,000 people would show up, and it was all about gaining the right to free speech on campus. But then the newspapers caught on. And so when you were walking to campus, you'd read these headlines saying, Berkeley rebels yell no at campus meeting. And before you knew it, before our very eyes, people were doing things to get into the headlines because they wanted to show the folks back home, or if the poor people at Harvard who weren't having a free speech movement, how well we were doing, and how, the greatness that we were accumulating. So very quickly things slid out of focus. So this is an example of how we can get attached to results. And it's extremely difficult to act passionately and then leave the results to God. As the Gita says, if you're motivated by personal results, it's a very strong word. You are really a wretch. It's a terrible state. So, having summed up, let's go on and take a look at, here's one of the most climactic actions that ever happened. April 6, 1930, Gandhiji has walked 212 miles with his 70 colleagues from his ashram, and he bends down to pick up some salt on the beach at Dandin. If you saw the Gandhi film, Attenborough's Gandhi film, which I hope you did, they do this scene very well. Man needs salt as he needs air. Well, this was the climax of the climax. Everybody recognized that the salt campaign, the salt satyagraha, had broken the colonial grip of the British Raj on India. And now the interesting thing was, after this tremendous campaign where hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people were involved, breaking the law, being thrown in jail, losing their property, and so forth. After all this work and all this sacrifice, the salt laws were not changed very much. So this really is about the perfect illustration of work versus work. That is, that everybody knew, because of Webb Miller, an American journalist who was on the scene when they were raiding the salt pans, everybody knew that the grip of the British Raj was broken, that India was free, but free in its own particular way. Arnold Toynbee, the great British historian, said about Gandhi, he made it impossible for us to go on ruling India, but he made it possible for us to leave without rancor and without humiliation. That was the insignia of doing something in the nonviolent spirit. So this illustrates very well the law that I told you about before of work versus work, that you can fail miserably to achieve what you personally want to get out of an action, but if you do it nonviolently, you have maintained your own spirituality, and it will have its telling effect on the situation that you'll benefit from somewhere down the line. It also illustrates another thing I like to call the stealth action in nonviolence, because the British really had no idea what this was going to do to them. In fact, the Viceroy in India cabled back to London saying, "I am not losing any sleep over the salt campaign." Well, he didn't lose any sleep, but he lost the whole empire over that campaign. So this is a very desirable methodology in nonviolence, to do something which the opponent doesn't recognize, that first of all, it's for their benefit, that you don't expect them to recognize that, but they don't even recognize what it is doing to the situation. So, but while this is a good example of how those pictures were colorized, by the way, and why I think it's not a sacrilege. So here's the action, and if you look at this book and read look at all the pictures from this era, from the spring of 1930, the amazing thing is Gandhi is having a ball. He's at his happiest. You know, he walks 15 kilometers a day, and then in the evening he goes out for a walk, just for a break, and he knows that he's bringing the whole country to a standstill, as all this utter turmoil, and yet you can just see in his face right here what is meant by non-attachment to results, which means acting from a spiritual place with spiritual power. There's another picture saying this is right from that same era. And of course, this is a famous one from a few months later. He's on his way on the ship to London. I was hoping to read you this quote. I know that you can't read it. He says, "Let me not be misunderstood." He's now talking about karma yoga, not in the context of a political struggle, but in the context of our Swadharma, what shall we do by way of using our labor. Let me not be misunderstood. I do not discount the value of intellectual labor, but no amount of it is any compensation for bodily labor, which every one of us is born to give. That's that concept of niyatam karma. We were born with a job. And if we want to be a success in this life, we have to find out what that job is, do it in the right spirit, and then leave the results to God. It is often is infinitely superior to bodily labor, but it never is or can be a substitute for it. Even as intellectual food, though far superior to the grains we eat, never can be a substitute for them, for those grains. Because without the products of the earth, those of the intellect would be an impossibility. So I wanted mainly to illustrate in this quote, it's full of wisdom, but I want to illustrate his idea, his belief, that we were born to carry out a particular task, and that for most of us, that has to involve bodily labor in the service of our fellow human beings. Let me read one more quote from Gandhi, and then I want to talk to you a little bit about how we can use these insights in our daily life and in our efforts at social change. He said, "Nonviolence in its dynamic condition means conscious suffering. It does not mean meek submission to the will of the evildoer, but it means the pitting of one's whole soul against the will of the tyrant. One's whole soul, not one's weapons. Working under this law of our being, it is possible for a single individual to defy the whole might of an unjust empire, to save his honor, his religion, his soul, and lay the foundation for that empire's fall or its regeneration." He had said that in 1920. In other words, that the potential of spiritual action carried out in this spirit that I've been trying to describe, and I'm sure there's much more to it than I've been able to understand, but this is what I've been able to understand so far. True spiritual action is not only a path to your own spiritual fulfillment, but it is infinite in its potential effects on the world around us. So let me share with you a little bit about one of the approaches that we've taken at the Metta Center to bring all of this into our daily practice. This is a model that we call the roadmap. And it's divided, as you see, into 6 sections. If you think of it as a pizza, it has 6 slices. And the top slice is called New Story Creation, because we are a little bit unusual as an active group in believing that everyone should be involved in helping to change what you might call the paradigm or the story under which we are living. I've just written a whole book on this subject, so I'm sure you don't want to get me started, or we will be here all night. But just to reiterate, I think it could be very effective if, when we are engaged in an action for the welfare of others, and we have an opportunity to do so, or we're challenged, that we're able to explain why, in a framework which is essentially the framework of the ancient Vedanta, why we are engaged in this action. Let me give you one concrete example. There was a fellow, he became a successful filmmaker, his name was Russo, and he was very clever at investing his money, so he had a lot of it, and he attracted the attention of one of the wealthiest people in the country. They were investing their money together, raking it in, and one day this person said to Mr. Russo, "Listen, I have a scheme," and he basically tried to induce him to become what we would call today an economic hitman. Said, we'll go down to, I think it was Ecuador, and we can loot the whole economy of that country and make millions. And Russo, even though he was wealthy, he still had his conscience intact. And he said, no, I don't want to do that. And this fellow, whose name I won't mention, said to him, "Why do you care about those people?" Well, this is a very rational scientific age. What if Russo had been able to say, they're not really those people. Don't you remember what Swami Vivekananda said? He wouldn't actually say that. But Swami Vivekananda said, the West has been seeking in vain for a reason for the commandment that love your brother as you love yourself. Okay, said Swamiji, here's the reason. Who do you think your brother is? I am my brother and he is me. Well, without necessarily going that far, it would be possible to say, both modern science and ancient wisdom are showing that we are all deeply interconnected. For example, a colleague of mine in the Midwest has developed a concept called perpetration-induced traumatic stress, which means the harm that you inflict on yourself when you inflict harm on others. It's now becoming a scientifically recognized concept. I'm sure you noticed in the newspapers that the state of Arkansas was disallowed from carrying out this orgy of executions for various technical reasons. But many groups got involved in saying, please don't do this. One of those groups, this is the interesting part, and a part for which we really don't have a good explanation, but we should be able to explain it. One of the people who begged the governor not to do this was the people who would have to carry out the executions, the executioners. They said, we can't stand this. It will be too hard on us to do such a thing. So now if we were able to explain that, as Swamiji said, when you kill another human being, you are killing part of yourself. We are deeply interconnected because we're not mere bodies. We're body, mind, and spirit. If we're able to explain that, I think our actions will be much more effective. Well, I don't need to go all the way around the rest of the pizza. It's kind of self-explanatory, and this is on our website. But I wanted to point out that we see activity in 3 concentric circles. There's person power, constructive program, and nonviolent resistance, or satyagraha. And this trajectory from person power to constructive program to nonviolent resistance is what Gandhi would have called swadeshi. You always start by working on your own circle, and when you have done what you can there, then your circle expands. But don't try to save the world before you have tried to save yourself to the best of your ability, before you have tried to remake the world rather than attack the parts of it that you don't like, and then you go out and attack what's left when you have to on that very strong foundation. So, one more slide I want to share with you, and this is where I'm going to get very technological, so hold on, here we go. Shoo! That inner circle of person power, we've come up with 5 suggestions that everybody can follow, which will enable us to get closer to our Swadharma and to carry out whatever actions we want to carry out on the world, on the social world around us, in a way that not only doesn't injure our spirituality, it enhances our spiritual growth and has our maximum impact on the world. So the first thing, and I don't feel it takes a lot of courage for me to say this in this audience, but I have had a lot of pushback in different places, and I only tried it once in Los Angeles. I don't think I'm going to try it again. But the first suggestion is we have to block out the enormous propaganda that is being brought into us every single day by the mass media. You know, studies have been done now that show that we see between 3,000 and 5,000 commercial messages every day. And underneath every one of those messages is the story, is the text, that you are a material being and you can only be fulfilled by gratifying your wants. And that is leading you right into the disaster that the Chandogya Upanishad was talking about. We are letting other people tell us what we want and tell us what to do, and so therefore we will never discover our own Dharma. That's paradharma. And you know, Anandamayi Ma said, man, meaning human being, appears to be the embodiment of want. Want is what he thinks about, and want is what he gets. Contemplate your true being, or there will be want, wrong action, helplessness, despair, and death. And so what the mass media are trying to get us to do is increase our wants and never, never contemplate our true being. So there you are. You've taken your television set out on the sidewalk, you've thrown away your earbuds, and suddenly you find yourself with a lot of time. and a big empty hole in your psyche, what do you do then? Well, learn about nonviolence. It turns out that nonviolence is not just a tactic. As Gandhi said, it is not the inanity that it's been taken for down the ages. It's a complete philosophy of life. In addition to doing these two things, of course, we strongly recommend, and again, in Berkeley, I'm not going out on a limb here, and in this audience, certainly not, we do recommend that everybody find some kind of spiritual practice, be it meditation or japa or whatever, because even if we were to stop the inflow of all of that materialist propaganda, it still has gotten to us. And besides, as the Gita says, again in chapter 7, we actually fall into Maya at birth. So the only way that we can get out of it is by learning to control the mind. And then the fourth thing that we recommend is what we call repersonalization, and just all we mean there is that you behave more personally with others whenever you have a chance. Every Tuesday night, I used to get into a car with a friend of mine, and we would drive up to Petaluma to attend a meditation class. When we got to, I was always late. As Stephanie will tell you, this is one of my main characteristics. I'm always running late. We would get to the Richmond Bridge, and he was driving, so he would say to the person collecting his money, "How are you today? Well, what's it been like out here?" And I used to sit there and say, "George, for God's sake, let's get back on the road, man. We have to get up to Petaluma and meditate." And suddenly I realized that he was doing it right. He had an opportunity to interact with another human being, and he took that opportunity. We're being conditioned not to take those opportunities. So that we can reverse deliberately. And then finally, as you get into your activities, whatever they are, use the opportunities that you're given to tell the new story, which of course is a very, very ancient story. It's a story of the Vedanta and many other spiritual traditions. Well, Swamiji, I see you're looking at your watch and I'm looking at the clock, and I want to thank you all for your patience. It's been wonderful sharing these ideas with you, and I wish you the very best. Thank you.
Take some questions.
Yes, but would you like to go to bed?
No. Yes. So now if you want to ask any question, please ask few question, pertinent question.
Yeah. Sir.
I've been really fascinated by the Peace and Conflict Studies program because I wandered into it one day. I was a visitor to campus and it was Ron Takaki's class.
It was not what?
It was Ron's class.
Okay.
And it was a superlative experience to see interdisciplinary studies with that focus on the Cal campus.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, after all these years, given what you said, whether you find that still the worthy model that you intended. Do you think that it's amplified in importance for our times? Do you see it as something that can be scaled to exist on other campuses? Do you think maybe the time is nigh for it to be a university approach?
Well, to start with your last question, definitely, I definitely think it's time for universal approach, and I've been noticing because Stephanie and I have a radio program every other week, and I've been trying to follow various kinds of news. There's a new thing happening, which is collaboration between a university and the peace activist world. Happened at Amherst and at Harvard. I don't know if you're aware of this. They've started a school called the Resistance School, and 50,000 people are following their courses. It's only been around for 3 weeks. So this is a whole new dimension. I actually have gotten kind of out of touch with what's actually going on at Berkeley, but I didn't feel between you and me that it was actually carrying out what I had originally hoped for it. It became something rather different, but I read the Bhagavad Gita, and it said, don't be attached to the results. Phew, because if I were attached to those results, I would have been very unhappy. So I think that particular experiment didn't work very well, but there are close to 300 peace studies programs in the US and Canada. And, you know, I used to say to my colleagues in political science, they would say to me, why do we need a peace studies program? And I would say, because you guys aren't teaching peace. You know, the whole point of political science should be the creation of peace among human societies. And since you're not, just like you have a biology program and all of these science programs, and they're not teaching anything about the environment. Okay, well, you don't want to get me started on what happens or doesn't happen at Berkeley. But the main point is, I think it's taken us a long time to realize that nonviolence can be learned as a subject as well as practiced and learned in the act of practicing it. And that if we're going to teach anything, we should be teaching that. Thank you. I promise to be a little bit more concise if you have any other questions.
Well, I'm going to ask another one then.
Okay, it's all yours.
So you mentioned the telling of the story and the power of the story,
Yeah.
and the paradigm.
Yeah.
And, you know, your academic discipline as a department, of course, these are artificial things,
Yeah.
is English and comparative literature, which is...
Classics and comparative literature.
Pardon?
Classics and comparative literature. Yeah.
Even better, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just asking you to elaborate on how you went from the strictures of the discipline you were in to develop these ideas further in your life, well beyond your study.
Yeah, that's, you know, I've often asked myself that same question. You know, I used to use this image that no sooner did I get my foot on the ladder, the academic ladder, than my spiritual teacher moved it over to a different building. Because I met Ishwaran at the conclusion of my PhD, so I've just become a professor when I met him, and so he started me on this practice of meditation and spiritual disciplines. And then that led to a very awkward period that lasted for a long time, where I was trying to do exactly what you're asking. How did I combine these things? One of the ways was that since I was so interested in nonviolence, I studied what the ancient texts had to say about violence, more or less explicitly. And I made some really, if I may say so, and I guess I kind of have to here, I made some really interesting discoveries about the meaning of violence in, say, the Odyssey and so forth. But that wasn't enough. I really wanted to go out, and so I taught a course. They had a program where you could teach a course on anything if you had a couple of professors doing it. So we teamed up with a colleague and we taught a course on nonviolence. Very successful, 100 students right off the bat. After teaching that twice, we said, okay, this has been a successful experiment. Where does it belong? So we went to the sociology department and said, oh, no, this is a religious studies course. So we went to religious studies and they said, no, that's political science. Long story short, no room at the end. You know, this cannot be taught. So I felt this is like the most successful, innovative thing I'd ever done, and it had no place in that institution. So the handwriting was on the wall, and I knew that I was going to have to leave at some point. But then a program in early retirement came along, and I grabbed it, much to the relief of my colleagues. And I had started this program in peace and conflict studies in order, quite selfishly, in order to be a home for my nonviolence course, which it was. I taught meditation in the morning and nonviolence in the afternoon. I was very happy. It lasted for a good bit. So I really had to use all my ingenuity and I have to say, it took a kind of courage because my colleagues were not going to approve of this, and they didn't. But I knew this was my Svadharma. And rather than do their thing and be very successful at it, get a MacArthur Genius Award and all those great rewards, I did this thing which was it just felt like it was right for me to do. And at one point, it was the largest peace studies program in the country. And so to have a program of that size at Berkeley had its effect, I'm sure. Yeah. Well, I promised I would be more brief, and then I wasn't. Yeah.
In light of this non-violence, what would you think of the idea of just war theory? That is brought up.
According to Gandhi, the only war that the Gita is really interested in is the internal battle. And chapter 2, I think, makes that very, very clear. I think that while the just war theory may have had some justification a couple of thousand years ago, none of its criteria apply to any conflict today. And actually, the church has reconsidered just war for the first time in 1700 years for that very reason. Because, proportionality, don't use more force than is required in a situation. What about that thing that we just dropped in Afghanistan? In the last 25 years or more, the proportion of civilian casualties to combatants has flipped. So it used to be it was mostly combatants, and accidentally a few civilians would be killed, but now it's by far more civilians than combatants are killed. So none of the criteria of the original just war theory, as it was elaborated by Ambrose and Augustine, apply at all anymore today. And even the church is becoming recognizing this fact. Yes, ma'am.
I would like to look at the subject of repersonalization, because I see that I'm not so sure that it's getting worse necessarily because of all the devices we have, because I think people move away from pain and away from congregating in general anyway. But I'm concerned about all the devices. I ate dinner the other night with my grandson and his phone.
Yeah.
And if I ask that not happen, we get into a fight.
Yep.
And people are not talking to people.
Yep.
They are living somewhere else than where they're sitting or breathing now.
Yep.
And I'm wondering where we're going and what you think about that.
Well, I think that in fact these devices are having a very bad effect, and I agree that they're not the only factor. People do try to, get into their own comfortable isolation sometimes, but we are a gregarious creature by nature, and I think this is a very serious misuse of technology. And I think the only way to overcome it, well, I guess two ways, is to point this out and to exemplify it in your own personal life. And, sometimes, people will whip out an iPhone and they see this clunky thing that I'm using, and Stephanie has an even more clunky one, and they will say, why don't you upgrade? And, we say, no, it's important for us to limit our addiction to technology. Now, I think one of the ways that you can help people get over this is point out to them how gratifying it is to shut the darn thing down and interact with another human being, even if that interaction is unpleasant in a way. You know, one of the studies that they did where they had families stop watching television for a period of time, one of the results they hadn't expected is a lot of those families said, for the first week we had terrible fights. Because, you know, we hadn't been paying attention to one another, so we hadn't dealt with any of this stuff. And then, you know, suddenly we had to face one another, and it was awful. We didn't know how to do it. But after a couple of weeks, they got it back. And so there is a period of adjustment, which a lot of people are not willing to believe in or face. Yeah. Sir?
Dr. Nagler, thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Very informative seminar. Your first few anecdotes that you mentioned about the friend calling,
Yeah.
asking you day about, etc. The thought occurred to me about spirituality and inner peace. Do you first find inner peace by doing certain rituals or whatever you have to do to be peaceful, and spirituality results from that? Or do you first find a way to become spiritual and that leads to inner peace? Or are they mutually exclusive?
I really don't think there's any meaningful definition of spirituality without inner peace. And you can approach, you approach finding inner peace, I think, through a balance of avoiding situations that you can't handle and dealing with ones that you can handle, even if they're ridiculously small. And that's your svadesha, you know, you go on to others. Now, in connection with our chart here, what we say is that what you have not accomplished on the level of person power will be a limiting factor on your success in constructive program. Similarly, if you haven't done your homework in constructive program, your protests will have, it'll be a limiting factor on how effective your protests are. So I don't know if that answers your question, but my latest thinking on it anyway.
Spiritual practice is within personal power.
Yes.
So it seems to me that that takes precedence, and that in turn results in peace.
Yes, it's reciprocal. Yeah, if you seek peace, it will help your spirituality.
Peace is on the outer periphery.
Well, peace as a global or social result is on the outer periphery, but you begin by trying to discover peace within yourself. Yeah. Yeah.
You said. No, go ahead. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So academics, religion, spirituality, in some ways, peace, they're all somewhat touched by money. So how do we collectively overcome that factor that seems to fuel so much violence?
Would you do me a big favor? Come up closer so I can really hear what you just said.
Okay. Did you get any of it?
I got some. I got the drift, but I am it.
Okay. I just said that so many things like academics, religion, peace in some ways are touched by money. So how do we collectively overcome the power of money and financial security that seems to fuel violence?
Thank you very much. I overcame the power of money by not having any and not getting a MacArthur Genius Award. But, you know, Socrates said that every profession has its goal, which is similar to a swadharma, and it has its corruption. And what we've been seeing, I think, over the last, well, certainly my adult lifetime, is profession after profession is being sacrificed to money. It's being turned over to the purpose of making money. And one of the ways, in fact, we just did an animation, 3-minute animation on the new economy. So watch for that. It's really good. We saw the video today. And watch for that on our website. But there are experiments going on, a great number of them actually, where people are trying to satisfy their basic needs. I mean, we had a cup of coffee today with Nipun Mehta, who's the developer of Surface Space, and his whole work of his whole life has been about generosity and paying it forward. So if you yourself are keeping your focus on the meaning of your action and its role, and incidentally, this is a good example of the fruits, right? Poem. If you're a doctor and you treat a patient to help them and they get better, that's perfectly okay. But if you start treating a patient in order to have a highly paid lifestyle, then that's attachment to the fruits, and you've corrupted your profession. It'll never satisfy you. In India, at least in South India, I understand, there's a subcaste of doctors, Vaidyas, who are called Visha Vaidyas. They're poison doctors. And so if you're bitten by a cobra or some other kind of serpent, you rush to one of these people. They can tell what kind of a critter bit you. They have all these herbs in their backyard. They save your life. And now here's the point. A Visha Vaidya, by long tradition, is not allowed to charge money. Because if you come in that desperate situation, they could be like a pharmaceutical company. Oh, yeah, you need that drug. Well, it just went up in price. It's $40,000 now from $17 last week. So I guess my concrete answer to your question is twofold, that partly learn to live without that attachment. You have to take care of your basic needs, of course. Don't get dependent on others, but learn to live without attachment to wealth, and then look around for some of these experiments where people are trying to live in whole communities that are close to the land and so forth. It's been very painful for me to watch this corrupting influence happening in, for example, education. And incidentally, when it happened in education, it was not something that was done by conservatives or reactionaries. Everybody across the board, regardless of their political persuasion, started saying, one way or another, the purpose of education is to have a good job, make money. The purpose of the university is to provide money to the state of California. I went and told the chancellor to stop doing this, but he didn't listen. So. Was there somebody? Yes, ma'am.
You said avoid mass media.
Yes.
Now, did you mean the media that just exposes violent news, or I mean, how does one do that?
Yeah, well, one way is to resort to alternative media, and there's quite a few channels now where you can get news, for example, without the sensationalism of the commercial media. And of course, an even bigger field is entertainment. Entertainment, quote unquote. That, you know, I personally have never owned a television set in my whole life. When I left my parents' home, much to their relief, I'm sure, from that day forward, I've never even been in a home, never lived in a home with a television set. And so my only exposure now is when in the locker room of my club where I go to work out. And you cannot believe what that looks like to me. It's just anger, fear, and greed, anger, fear, and greed. And there is a film, a long documentary film done by the BBC called Century of the Self, which will show you how advertisers and entertainment people, and in fact news people, because they have to sell newspapers, are manipulating our lowest sanskars, the worst part of our nature. And so if you're in doubt about which media to avoid, just avoid all of it. You'll do fine. Eventually, sorry?
Not to to watch TV at all.
No one has ever died from not watching TV. Actually, the majority of the development of Homo sapiens, TV was not available. And yet we developed universities and nonviolence programs and all of these wonderful things. So yes, I think you start by just plain not exposing yourself. Later on you'll develop, I see you, Sally, thank you. Later on you'll develop some discrimination, and you can watch things that do not arouse anger, fear, and greed. Sally.
Yeah. How do you bring people together to have the conversations that they need to have to move towards nonviolence?
Excellent question. I said to a young friend of mine some years ago, still with the academic penumbra hanging over my head, I said, we're going to start a think tank. I thought she would be thrilled. Imagine my chagrin when she wrinkled up her nose and said, we do not need another think tank. And she said, what we need is a hope tank. So I said, I like that idea. So we now have an institution that we've developed in our place up in Petaluma called a hope tank. Once a month, we all get together, we meditate for half an hour, and then we break for potluck breakfast. Stephanie makes chai, and very good. And then we migrate into a conversation, and we only ask that the conversation be about things that really matter, and that it be approached in a completely open-minded spirit. So if somebody comes up with an idea you don't like, you don't shut them down and say, that'll never work. Everything is up for consideration. And I'm happy to say that we now have a document called How to Start a Hope Tank. It's going up on our website very soon. There's one in Marin County, one in Berkeley, and one in North Carolina. And I think it's only a matter of time before we take over the world. What do you think, Swamiji?
I think everyone has already asked questions what they have.
Yeah. And I want to ask us to especially appreciate Swamiji, who is unwell and who has nonetheless come and presided over this occasion. That was a real sacrifice.
Thank you very much, Professor Nagler. It is a great presentation, and what my understanding is that the foundation is the spirituality. The attitude should be the non-violence. Non-violence not in act only, by act, by mental setup, and by thoughts also. So these three types of non-violence, and this is the attitude, and for that one should have tremendous foundation of spirituality and courage. Courage is very, very important for non-violence. Just imagine the courage of Mahatma Gandhi. What a tremendous courage he had. So courage is very important for non-violence. So thank you, Professor Nagler, wonderfully presented this very, very profound idea. This is very profound idea, and because Professor Nagler is in that, his mind, his soul is completely dedicated to that idea. So he is the embodiment of that idea. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation and for presenting this beautiful lecture. So as a mark of respect and regard, a token gift on behalf of Vedanta Society. Birthday.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you. Next time, I promise I'll be born in India. Thank you very much.
Thank you, all of you, for attending this beautiful lecture. Our next announcement is that on Sunday at 11 o'clock, we have a special lecture. One of our Brahmachari Buddha Chaitanya, he had his PhD from UC Berkeley in philosophy. So he will be delivering a talk on Sunday morning, The Harmony of Religions according to Sri Ramakrishna. And next Living in Spirit lecture will be on 17th June, that is Saturday, 17th June at 4 p.m. in this hall. And Dr. Sally Goldman will be presenting that talk. You all are welcome with your friends, family and acquaintances. Thank you very much.
So I hope you get some rest.
Yes.
You want to take this? Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, it is a great pleasure.
It's a wonderful crowd you have here, wonderful audience. Yeah, I see some of my old friends out there.
Yes, I think your
PK.
Some of your students are.
Yes, quite possibly. Yeah.